Good morning and welcome everyone. Today we have something really exciting for you to discuss because we're talking about an open source project which is not as typical as others, and it's really about the prehistory of Bitcoin. Because there are few people that really understand the history of Bitcoin. Let's just do a show of hands. How many of you have read, for instance, the block size war? All right, good. That's an excellent start. But there are even fewer people who understand, like, what was the history. The percentage of the audience was roughly, let's say, 35%. German accuracy. And so there are even fewer people out there who understand not only the history of Bitcoin, but also the prehistory of it. Like, what are the ideas, thinkers, cypherpunks that have influenced, that led to the accumulation of that, what was then become Bitcoin. And here we have Aaron van Wirdum. He is an expert in this. He is a technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine. He has made these topics accessible for everyone. And now he is open sourcing a book, thegenesisbook.com. You can find it here, where he talks about the prehistory of Bitcoin. And I'm very excited to talk with him about this. My name is Dr. Wolf von Laer, and I'm the CEO of Students for Liberty, which is the largest pro-liberty student organization on the planet, with students in over 103 countries. And I want to orange pill all of them, so I'm glad that I will be sharing this book and its insights from Aaron with my audience for sure. And when I was talking about the book with my wife, actually, it was really interesting to see, who's here in the audience as well, how interesting it was, like how many ideas from the prehistory of Bitcoin were so relevant for understanding Bitcoin today.
Right.
But maybe you can tell us a little bit about like what motivated to write this book.
Yeah, so I started researching these topics like 5 years ago, more or less. So back then, there was this sort of general, like if you read a Bitcoin book that was written around then there was usually mentions and that there was this group called the cypherpunks, that there was sort of these other digital cash projects they worked on. But generally, I think the general sentiment even back then was Bitcoin kind of came out of nothing. Like there was nothing, and then all of a sudden there was Bitcoin. And then, like I said, if you read a book about Bitcoin, then maybe it was sort of mentioned in the intro that there were some other things. But there was not really more than that. There was no story, so to say. There was no really telling of what actually happened there. So I found it interesting. I am technically a historian. I got a degree in history. And I think if you want to understand how things work or why things are the way they are, then history is a pretty good place to start. So I think that's true for Bitcoin as well. So what I do in the book is, I should mention, I also wrote a couple of articles over the years. So I did my research. I wrote the Genesis Files articles. So I published some of that, and I really expand on that in the book, essentially. So yeah, the idea is, it's a history book. So it tells the prehistory of Bitcoin and the people and the projects that sort of led to Bitcoin. But in the same, it's also a book about Bitcoin itself, really. Like it's threaded throughout. Like if you really want to understand Bitcoin, then I hope my book will help with that. So it really sort of takes the step-by-step, like the invention of public key cryptography, the invention of proof of work, and sort of the book evolves in that way. So it's a perspective, I think, of understanding Bitcoin, and it's like a historic perspective of understanding Bitcoin itself. That's kind of the idea. And Wolf is a very professional. He's very good at this kind of stuff. So he prepped me. So he told me, you got to come up with like good quotes for Twitter. So I got a good one. So every hero needs a good origin story. So I decided to write Bitcoins.
All right, very good. I like that. And typically when you think about like history, like why do we need it and so forth, but your book is really every step of the way super relevant about like what Bitcoin is today. It like really describes like what the ethos is that influences all of us today, and it's really, really interesting. And so you are writing also a lot about like how, for instance, Austrian economics has influenced early, or like basically the people that came before Satoshi Nakamoto that influenced Satoshi, obviously. So tell us a little bit more about Hayek and what were some of his novel insights on money that influenced cypherpunks?
Yeah, so when I started doing this research, this was not a direction I expected to be going in. I was not a big Austrian economics buff or anything like that. I knew that it had something to do with Bitcoin. I was hearing that, and so But then when I started to do my research, Hayek kept being brought up by cypherpunks, by extropians, which we can also talk about. Hayek was like a big inspiration for these people that were working on these kinds of projects, even so before Bitcoin. Money-wise, so the most obvious sort of Hayekian influence is probably the denationalization of money. So he wrote this book in 1976, and he republished it 2 years later, I think, like a revised version, about separating money and state, essentially. Now, that's not entirely novel, because, of course, Austrians always believed gold should be money, so that's also a separation of money and state. But Hayek really came up with this radical idea at the time that we could do even better in the gold. Like, the market can figure out a form of money that's even better in gold and definitely better than fiat. He didn't like fiat at all. So that's sort of an obvious one that I think a lot of people, or at least some people, will know about. This is an idea that's sort of foundational to Bitcoin and that Bitcoin represents. But I kept reading Hayek, and I found something that I found very interesting is that so the book I mentioned was in the 70s. In the 30s, Hayek was also writing a lot about money. He had these big debates with Keynes on monetary policy, and there was the stabilizers movement. So back then, that was in the 20s even, I think. There was this group of economists that believed that money should have a stable value, which, the purchasing power should stay stable over time. And Hayek was writing about that as well. And in one of his articles, papers, he also writes about what his ideal form of money really would be. So what would really be the ideal form of money? And if you read that, he's basically he's describing Bitcoin. He's writing it should be an international currency, borderless, homogeneous, and there should be a fixed supply. So there should be only a limited amount of money. So that's what he wrote. Now, that was completely new to me that he was writing about it in that way, because actually in the denationalization of money, he does have a slightly different perspective. I'm going on a tangent now, but so his main perspective is leave it to the market, and then he sort of speculated what the market would settle on. But then if you go back to the 30s, he had a more clear idea, like it should be a fixed amount. Okay, so why don't we know about this, or why is this not as well known? I think it's because he kind of gave up on that idea. So he writes like, this would be ideal, but we can't do it. There's no way to do it. Why is there no way to do it? Because who can be trusted to not inflate the supply? No one can be trusted to do that. There's going to be a country in charge of this, or but that breaks down. Like any international agreement will break down in case of war, in the worst case scenario. So there's just no way to do it. There's no institution we can find that can actually manage a fixed supply of money. So in a way, Satoshi came along. He said, "Hold my beer," and he Hayek. He said, "No, we actually can do this. We can do a fixed supply of money without an institution. We don't need trust," which is also something like Szabo wrote about this much later. Very similar type of topics. So I found it very interesting that Hayek was writing about this even back then. So that's Hayek. Wolf has been helping me with the book. He's been proofreading. A bunch of people have been doing that. Wolf has been very helpful in the economic part of it. So Hayek turned out to be a big part of the book, a big inspiration for the cypherpunks and for the extropians.
That's a fantastic quote. So Satoshi Nakamoto out-Hayeked Hayek, because Hayek was complaining about that there is no way to take the power away from the central banks. You don't want to take it away with government. That would just lead to like a lot of hostility. Therefore, you have to come up with like a sly roundabout way to overcome it. And Satoshi found that sly roundabout way.
That's the other thing. I didn't even mention that. There's the famous Hayek quote, right, which you mentioned. That's the opening quote of my book, actually.
Oh yeah.
And that encapsulates so well what the book is in a way, because it really brings together this group of people that were building privacy technologies that couldn't be stopped, and then monetary reformers, and that was a marriage, sort of, and that was what Hayek was describing. Again, actually, in that sense, also Satoshi sort of out-Hayek, because if you watch the full interview, Hayek is, in that quote, he's sort of thinking of creating a derivative type of product that technically wouldn't be money, but that could be used as money, but couldn't be banned. I don't know why he thought that, but he had some idea. And then Satoshi came, no, we'll actually just do money.
That's very fascinating. And then you can see, you already get like a sense of the book and how important it is, because like a lot of you people here in the audience, like you are doers, like you're writing code and you're continuing in that ethos of Satoshi. However, there's also these ideas that he has read and he clearly has consumed that influenced him, and that changed like how he looked at code and what we can do in order to bring like more freedom and the tool of liberation to the world, which is fascinating. But Hayek did not only write about like monetary economics. So tell us a little bit more about the relevant insights that he produced that influenced cypherpunks beyond that.
So if there's like one theme throughout the book, it's probably spontaneous order. So this idea that Hayek really popularized, and it essentially contrasts top-down design. So he writes about it in different contexts. So one of them is the free market. And it essentially means people acting in their own self-best interest, emerging, through individual action, complex types of organizations can emerge. So in the case of the free market, that would be the allocation of resources. Mm-hmm. So rather than Soviet-style central planning, it's people acting on their own interest, and that's how the economy works. But he has more examples of that. So one I really like is language. Mm-hmm. It's actually something I wrote about years ago myself. It's all in the context of Bitcoin before I knew about Hayek. There's this article, a primer on Bitcoin governance, why developers aren't in control of the protocol. So this was in the heat of the block size wars, and people were putting a lot of pressure on the Bitcoin core developers to change Bitcoin, to increase the block size. And then I thought that's the wrong focal point, because the Bitcoin core developers aren't really in control. It's all of us, everyone who's running a node. It's all of us making Bitcoin essentially. So in that article I made the analogy with language. Like there was no point in time when someone sat down with a sheet of paper and a pen and invented the English language and its grammar. It's something that people just started using and started settling on, and the two of us are speaking English because it benefits me if people can actually understand what I'm saying, and vice versa, and use the same grammar rules even though there's no one dictating it. It's just us settling on it because it's in our own self-interest and it benefits everyone, and that's how you get a complex language. So that's sort of spontaneous order in a nutshell, and I think that really applies to Bitcoin as well in several ways. So one way is it's an open source project. So this is another example of that. So Eric S. Raymond wrote about this. He was a Linux developer, and he wrote about the potential of open source. Linus's law comes from it. With enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So he wrote about a successful open source project has many contributors. So how do you get many contributors? It means it needs to be a project that people want to contribute to. So they need to get something out of it, either because they want the project to succeed or because it scratches an itch they have. So there needs to be something for it. It can't really be a completely centralized top-down. Like you need help from people. So you need to kind of give people a reason to help you. So that's true for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an open source project, and people need to want to help to it. But there's also the more money level. So people adopt Bitcoin voluntarily. That's another example Hayek gives. So that's the big issue. Also in the same interview where the quote comes from, he says, so it's language, law, and money are sort of the big institutions of spontaneous order. And money has been banned from sort of evolving that way. Governments just sort of stepped in once money arrived or first emerged, and they said you can't develop it from here. And there's also a chapter, for example, on e-gold. That's the intro chapter. So Douglas Jackson tried to create a digital form of money based on gold, and he got hammered by the U.S. government. So there's a lot of examples where the U.S. government or governments in general just won't allow money to really be a free market product. So Bitcoin is that. So Bitcoin is an emergent form of money that people choose to adopt. And then finally, Bitcoin could potentially enable a better form of free market, so better spontaneous order in that sense. So yeah, so that's also, yeah, like I said, it's a theme throughout the book that sort of recurs a couple of times. So yeah, even more Hayek.
So this gave you all like a little bit of a taste what kind of like interesting insights are in there. And you can right now look at the book. So go to thegenesisbook.com and you can read the book. You can contribute to it if you like. So there's not many open source books being written these days, but like Aaron is really inventing and is going to be very innovative on this way. So how did you come up with some fans there already. It's very good. So tell us, like, how did you come up with the idea to open source this book and what motivated you?
So it was a very early idea I had. Andreas Athanopoulos, of course, did it. He did it a bit different because he really sort of started from zero with the project, and it was an open source book from the start. So I considered doing that at the time, but then I thought that's probably not going to work for the type of book I want to write because it's much more narrative. It's actually got like a story and a structure, and I think that's probably an example of where top-down design does actually work, because it could be chaotic otherwise. So I want to like lay out the structure of the book. This is sort of the story I want to tell. And then, so we're on the open source stage, so it does feel a little bit like an open source project maybe. Like I wrote an alpha version, an alpha draft, which I knew was going to be sloppy and not great. And then I sent different chapters to different people that I knew were going to be able to help me improve that. So you're one of them. P. Rizzo has been a great help. For example, he's helping with the narrative sort of structure. Tony Klausing has been helping. Jan Burgers, who's a Dutch podcast host. I did a podcast with him. I'm going to forget people now, so I probably shouldn't even start mentioning people. Also, some of the people that are in the book have been looking at it. Adam Gibson, I should mention, who's been looking at cryptography stuff. Wide looked over it. David Chaum. Anyways, so then I got it to like a beta. So now it's pretty much beta. I still had this idea, like I want one more go of this. I want one more kind of round of feedback before I put it out. So I was thinking, okay, who else can I have this read to? Who else would be a good fact checker or that kind of stuff? And so I was thinking about that, and then I realized, why not everyone? I want to make the book as good as I can make it. I write in the book why open source makes sense. I just mentioned Linus's law. Hayek writes about the knowledge in society, like people. This is also what inspired Jimmy Wales for Wikipedia, just crowdsource the information. So at this stage, I wanted to make it as good as I can make it, and I figured it makes sense to just open source it and gather feedback that way. So it's still going to be a book. There will be a book. But for now, it's also an open source project. So I'm inviting people to go to the website. It's actually as a redirect at this point. It will get you to a Google Drive, and that's where you'll find the book in Google Docs. I thought about using GitHub. That's almost synonymous with open source, right? So I thought about doing that, but I also spoke with Andreas about it and got his feedback, and then I just realized, actually, Google Docs is much easier for everyone, including me, apart from developers, but it's lower bar of entry, so I'm using that.
Maybe in the closing, you could help the audience understand, and me understand, like, what were some of the projects before Bitcoin that were major, and why did they fail?
Okay, we got a minute. So the main projects in the book, the digital currency projects that are described are Chaum's DigiCash, eCash, Hashcash, BitGold, B-Money, White Ice B-Money, and then Hal Finney's RPow. One of the common themes of why they didn't work out, I think, is because some of them weren't fully developed. Others had a chicken and egg problem. Like, what's actually the incentive to start using it? And I think Bitcoin solved that in a very clever way as well, with a 21 million limit. Right. Because now there's a potential that your money will actually appreciate in value. So even if you don't care for some reason about the Hayekian ideal money kind of part, you should still care that Bitcoin can actually succeed and people will actually adopt it. It overcomes the chicken and egg problem.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Aaron, thank you. Check out this book, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.